others flourish.
Mm.
Therefore, having that radical way of thinking doesn't work.
Okay, so I know that the interview has gone a little long, but I want to get to this final section because
Mm.
I think this is probably the most important section to really discuss tonight. And it goes into new territory between conservatives and Muslims. I think that one of the problems in, at least the Western world is that we've developed a great suspicion of Muslims, and many conservatives that I've met have said, no, there's no way to reform Islam. They just need to give up everything and become like us, maybe like a more radical view of assimilation. And I say, wait, no. Like, I know Muslims throughout my life, and they've demonstrated the same natural law Aristotelian principles. I see that our intellectual traditions are very interrelated with each other. So I think maybe the first place we need to begin is, what conceptions are there about Islam and what is really Islam in your perspective?
So, I'll first start with my own personal understanding of Islam. So, Islam fundamentally is the recognition that there is one and only one God. For me personally, the God of classical theism. So, this is Aristotle's unmoved mover. This is Aquinas's purely actual being, or the being whose essence and existence are identical, whose essence is existence, that is to be what he is. And from that, so that's more of the natural theology side of things. I think divine simplicity would be a part of the Islamic canon. I'm not quite sure. But because I need to study this stuff in more depth, but my understanding is that, and for Islam specifically, as a faith, it's the faith that we acknowledge that there is only one God, that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is the final messenger of God, that the Quran is the verbatim word of God, transmitted through the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And we have the 5 pillars of Islam. So daily prayers, fasting during the month of Ramadan, doing the pilgrimage, giving to charity, so zakat, and what is known as the shahada. So basically the will being oriented and the utterance, there is only one God, and Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is his prophet. So that's the skeleton, if you will, of Islam, from my understanding anyway. And the way that I think about how it's being conceptualized now in the West is you have broadly 2 ways of thinking about it. One is as you noted, the conservative way is that, Islam is a threat to Western civilization, because it's a backward, barbaric, if you will, third world way of thinking. And by third world, I don't mean, I guess, inferior because it's the third world, but like it's more of a, not as a developed way of thinking, I guess. And the other side is, no, Islam is not that. Islam is, this is going to the identity politics side of things. Islam shares many, many values with the West, and based on a more culturally relative point of view, we should not criticize what certain Muslims do that are wrong. And I think I genuinely heard someone say one time that they were in I think it was a cultural studies or anthropology class, and the teacher, almost with like a willing smile on their face, was talking about female genital mutilation, I think in Pakistan or wherever it was, or some African country. And the criticism wasn't allowed there. We couldn't, at least my friend could say, this is an absolutely barbaric act. Because the reply is, well, you don't know Islam, you don't know what's going on there, you don't know their justifications for that. Now, I, as a Muslim, say, no, there is only one set of truths that we have, right? There is only one objective set of truths, and we ought to, instead of going back to Aristotle for a second, right? What he did when it came to in his politics, right, and in the Constitution of Athens, which may or may not be his particular work, but the politics certainly is. The purpose of comparative politics is not to, I guess, like do a landscape, like study of all the different kinds of political and cultural systems, and then say, oh yeah, that one's got these things, that one's got these things, but they're all the same, just with different flavors, right? For me, the purpose of comparative politics and comparative religious studies and so on and so forth is to say, these cultures have these particular good things, these particular bad things. Let's figure out which culture is the most conducive to human nature, which one best maps onto the flourishing of the individual and the society, and then try and model ourselves on that culture, or on that ideal culture. So when it comes to critiquing to critiquing particular Muslim practices that individual Muslims do, I am with the conservatives where they say that, them blowing themselves up, or them doing whatever things they do as individual Muslims in the name of Islam, that's categorically not right. And nowhere can you find any justification for that. It's just them like forcing in their ideology and cherry picking particular sentences.
Yeah. So when people ask the question, is Islam a religion of peace? Do you think that's a misleading question, or do you think the person who's asking the question kind of has a hidden agenda that makes the question seem not as genuine as it could be? Because it seems as if it's implicitly saying, right, like, no, Islam has to prove that it is a religion of peace. That is why I asked the question. And it's, like, I mean, is Islam a religion of peace? What do you think about that question itself, and how would you answer it?
I do my best to not assume motives and intentions based on other people, because I can't see what's in their hearts and in their minds. But look, we've had the conversation enough, like frequently enough, for anyone who just does a YouTube search on is Islam a religion of peace to find their own answers from people who are far more authoritative than I am on this particular question. And the fact that it's constantly being asked over and over and over again does get a bit tiring, and it makes you wonder, what do you not hear what I say when I give you the direct answer? It seems to me that Islam just happens to be the religion which is trying to justify itself to the West, and but particular people in the West. And it's because, going back to the frank way of thinking, right? People say, well, look, this particular Muslim did this, therefore they are representative of the entire Muslim community. Therefore, the Muslim community must then apologize for that person, which is the wrong way to go about thinking about it. Well, so I would definitely say that.
Yeah, and one of the problems too is that, for the conservative movement, it seems as if, as we've gone away from just domestic issues to foreign policy, we've kind of adopted a very strong sense of neoconservatism, right? And the claim is that classical conservatism is too weak. It doesn't take us to our logical conclusion, while conservatism says, look to the entire world. This is how you flourish with a Western type of liberal democracy, with our institutions and traditions and so forth. And the implicit assumption, right, is that Islam is somehow teaching a counter narrative that itself makes it inferior. And the sad thing is that for somebody like me, I enjoy Douglas Murray on a lot of points, and I like reading his stuff, and I like watching him. But there are times, though, where I question, how aggressive is he making conservatism to be? Is it more aggressive than it is necessary? So let me pose some questions to you on this area, right? So I don't know how familiar you are with Douglas Murray, but what do you think about his objections? And then, another figure that I look to is Majid Nawaz. I think that he seems to be pretty reasonable. What do you think about those two individuals?
Right. I'm not too sure about Murray's work, actually. If you wouldn't mind just sharing like specific questions based on what he says. But before
Yeah.
that, I just want to just clarify one thing, because you were saying that, you know, Islam is characterized as against the West.
Hmm.
Um, you have to, I think, make more well known the fact that Aristotle came into the West, was reintroduced into the West through Islam, through Islamic scholars.
Yeah.
So anyone who uses Aristotle's work today, or the Aristotelian work today, is, if you will, like springing off of Islamic scholarly developments on his work. So Thomas Aquinas himself, quotes very many Islamic scholars. So I just wanted to put that out there before we got into the specific questions on Murray, because otherwise it was going to escape my mind.
That's very important. Yeah, so Douglas Murray, he wrote a book called The Strange Death of Europe. And I think the subtitle was Immigration, Identity, and Islam. And Douglas Murray's point is that the European Union has, implemented immigration policies, and other nations have followed with their own immigration policies, such that they bought into the idea of multiculturalism. So they believed that they could just open their borders, let anybody in without any consequences, and they would just naturally somehow, absorb the society and blend in. But instead, what they have found is that, they've created their own Sharia courts. They have done terrible acts in those countries to harm the citizens. They've also, in some sense, undermined, for him, European or British identity and Western culture and values. Of course, that's a very controversial argument, but I want to get what your take is on that.
Yeah. So this is going into the difference between multiculturalism and cultural pluralism.
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess I'll go from those two and then I'll go back to your question. So the argument against a multicultural nation is that we are going to have a conflict of values when it comes to different cultures clashing within any given nation. And if we don't have gradual, incremental, I guess, a buffering process where we can begin to figure out which specific cultural practices do and don't gel well together. If we don't have that, then we're going to have issues arising, and the issues are, as you just said, people like Murray saying, well, look at the horrible acts that these people from different cultures commit, which are not British cultural values. That's if we think about where you have the overarching British, I guess, system, then you have the Muslim culture, the Christian culture, say, black culture, white culture, and so on and so forth. Whereas if we think of more of a culturally pluralist way of thinking about society, what we do is we take the common cultural principles within each subculture, I guess. We agree on what the basics are, and then we begin to navigate what the more peripheral cultural practices are. So as we were discussing on the chat the other day, the right to life, the right to liberty, the right to education, and so on and so forth, these are good, and I think these are pretty much throughout every single culture, more or less. So let's say, okay, we're going to have broad cultural precepts that affirm the most fundamental natural rights that we have. But when it comes to specific, and to use a technical term, the more accidental cultural practices of dress, food, different ways of dancing, which essentially make up that culture, but they're not what make us essentially human. Whereas the right to life is what makes us human, right? Is to have that right built in place. When it comes to navigating the Muslim culture, or to be a bit more general, or a bit different in that way of analyzing it, Pakistani culture and Saudi culture, to be able to assimilate these cultural practices within British or Australian or American Western values, we say, cool, what do we have in common? what is different, and are these commonalities substantial, and are the differences beneficial towards human flourishing or contrary to human flourishing. If they're contrary, we don't want them. So we don't get rid of your entire culture. We say this cultural artifact, this cultural practice is not tolerated here, but the rest of your culture is.
But Jeremy, like, the response is going to be from the left. Well, that's imperialistic of the West. That's a form of imperialism and dominance. And how can you, the white Christian Western world, tell other people what to do? Isn't that just repeating the past? What's your response?
Right. It's funny because I'm not a white Christian male or white Christian dominating thing. So I would say that whenever someone, even that judgment itself, that you are being imperialistic, you are imposing your standard onto other people. Well, I can flip that and say, well, you're imposing your standard of multiculturalism onto the imperialistic. We can't just say you're imposing this, therefore we end the discussion there. We have to take it. I firmly believe, right, that when it comes to solving a problem, we either have to go down a level of analysis into the more nitty-gritty details, or get a more bird's eye view. We're not really going to solve it at that same level. So when it comes to saying I'm being imperialistic by saying that there are facts of the matter as to which cultural practices are or are not conducive to human well-being, if they're going to argue that it's imperialistic, then they don't understand what culture means. To me, culture just is. What culture means is a set of habits and practices that are unique to a particular ethnicity or to a particular people. So when we demystify the word culture, because culture tends to be used as this way of saying, like, you hear the word culture, oh, then I can't critique it because it's culture, it's sacred. No, culture just means habits that people have in a particular given place. And the lessons that they are taught. Once we understand that that's what culture is, and culture exists for our flourishing, not the other way around. We don't exist for the sake of perpetuating any given culture. Culture naturally emerges from our being in the world and our differences, and it's beautiful to have different cultures. But to say that I'm being imperialistic when I say that Western culture is superior to Eastern culture, or Islamic culture is superior to Western culture, if I were to say these things, it's not really getting to what's the actual problem, and it's not getting towards solutions either.
So let me kind of propose two kind of scenarios to you, some problems. I know that the interview is going a little long, but like I really want to touch on some of these issues if you don't mind. So I know in France, for example, they legislated, I don't know if the law still stands, but I remember, there was a law that said women cannot wear the burqa, if I'm not mistaken. The burqa, if I understand properly, is the full covering and just where there's slits for the eyes and that's it. Is that correct, or is that the niqab?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, so I think France for a bit, I don't know if they still are, but they banned the burqa, and the idea is that in Western culture, the human face is very important for establishing community. So we really do care about whether or not we can see each other's faces. And yes, that is an aesthetic value, but it is connected in some sense to a moral value of trust and so forth. And the objection was that, well, look, I understand that this is an aesthetic judgment and it seems kind of trivial, but at the same time, that was connected to something so important to Western culture, which is the appearance and the visibility of the face, right? Do you think that that was the proper approach for France to go down?
No, I don't really think so. And it's interesting because France self-promotes as an egalitarian nation. Well, first of all, I'll say that there's nothing, if you will, Islamic about that particular style. Like the first principles behind why women are asked to cover up, which again, I'm really convinced that they have to cover up their entire body, including the face. I would say that what is asked for is modesty, and modesty relative to where they are. So in the household, they're allowed to walk around normally without having to cover up everything. When they go outdoors, just like is expected of men, dress modestly. So I just want to get that out of the way, because many people think, Muslims looks a certain way. Men wear a white robe
Yeah.
with a red Saudi turban, and women wear a hijab. No. A woman wearing a hoodie can be considered dressing Islamically if she's doing it for the sake of modesty. Please repeat again the point about the value of the face.
Yeah. So this is an argument that I heard from a conservative philosopher that I respect a lot, Roger Scruton, and his point was that his point was that in Western culture, the human face is very important, right? We care about the visibility of another person because we want to be able to trust them, and we consider that a first kind of bridge to trust them. On the other hand, when people invade, another community or culture, they tend to cover up their faces and to remain hidden. So he's saying that there is this aesthetic judgment that is there, that is kind of a difference, I guess, between Islamic and, Western culture, broadly speaking.
Yeah. So I'll speak for myself, not for Islam.
Yeah.
It seems to me that we are exposed enough to faces in the West for the threshold of modesty to be, not needing to cover the face. And I do think that it is very important to be able to see the face, because what is it, like 80% of communication is body language, and a large percentage of that is the face itself. Smiling, frowning, the eyes being furrowed, so on and so forth. So I would say that this is where the idea of people who want to go to not only West, but people who want to go to any country with a different culture, they should do as much as they can to assimilate into that culture. Otherwise, it's unnecessarily causing tensions. Now, I am not saying that we ought to ban the burqa, not at all, because it could just, I could be wrong, and there could be massive wisdom in, even given the norm in having the face exposed, there could be a benefit to covering it. I haven't navigated that particular argument enough to make a judgment one way or the other. But it seems to me to be the case that as long as a woman or anyone is modestly dressed and doesn't, like, modesty really comes down to the person's character and personality. If I act boisterous and out there, then that is not being modest. And it seems to me that when it comes to the way that we think about female beauty compared to male beauty, I think it's fairly commonsensically obvious that, if you just look at the fashion industry or like models and all that kind of stuff, there's a far bigger market for women to beautify themselves than to men to beautify themselves. And I think that does touch on a very deep, it's not just a socially constructed thing, which is a whole other topic. Social construction is so badly used usually. But it's something deep within us that we, like women, I guess, tend to beautify themselves more. I'm not sure quite what it is, but Scruton does touch on a very, very important point there. And as both Westerners and as Muslims, or as a Muslim Western person like myself, we need to take this seriously. Does covering up the face for a Muslim female, will God punish her for that? As Muslims, we need to figure that out.
Okay, so
it could just be that. Oh yeah, you're good. Yeah.
Oh well, did you have a thought that you want to finish?
Well, I was just going to say that when it comes to, because ultimately for us it's about salvation, right? We don't want to tempt people and this and that as people. So it could just be that God will understand that if we're in the West, it's better for you to not cause tensions and to show your face than to cover your face and show tensions. I don't know.
Yeah, and one important thing about this conversation too is that I have many Muslim, followers on my page who actually enjoy the content that I share, and it means a lot to me to see that yes, like conservatism can bridge different identities and traditions because that is our origin, right? We share many of the same traditions, the same backgrounds, and so forth, and that's what unites us. Let me go into 3 final questions, okay? And we can cut it there. I don't know, am I cutting into any of your precious scheduling?
No, for now we're good.
Okay,
yeah,
cool. Yeah. So, right now in the States, for me, it's 11:12 p.m., and I honestly don't care. I'm having such a great time. So let's go into this next question.
I have plenty of time. Yeah, we're good.
Okay. So, then I won't make it a bullet round. I'll kind of give everything its due time.
Sure. I mean, are you planning on cutting this afterwards, or are you just going to upload the whole thing as
I'm probably going to cut it in half at this point,
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. So,
that's cool.
Roger Scruton also wrote a paper titled The Political Problem of Islam. And the general idea that I got from this paper was that when you look at the Muslim tradition or the Islamic tradition of jurisprudence, philosophy of law, what you're able to see is that in some sense, there is this kind of hostility towards an idea of secular rule. Now, it depends on what you mean by secular, but for the most part, let's say that laws are to be implemented because they're accepted by the community, right? So they are man-made, so to speak. And that is the distinction that even Christianity accepts. Jesus says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and give to God what belongs to God. There's kind of a different domain that exists in some minor sense of the word secular.
Yeah.
So Scruton looks at, one particular scholar, Ibn Khaldun, in the 1400s. And I think Khaldun said that there could never be a secular state because at the core, what keeps the society together is this thing called asabaya. And asabaya is just this connection between individuals and people, and it comes from God. And God is the one who makes it legitimate, right? And then when you look at the Muslim tradition, right, at one point, Muhammad, the prophet, was a ruler in some sense of the word. He did have a kingdom, an empire. I don't know if he had an empire, perhaps. But people say, well, look, Islam is inherently combining religion with politics. And yes, Christianity did the same thing, but look, it's built within the Islamic tradition itself, and that's the problem. What would your response be to that?
Right. So the problem there being that we can't separate the religion from the politics, right?
Something like that, yes.
Yeah. It seems to me that we need to make sure that we delimit or delineate these things properly. So if we're, let's say I'm going to use Aquinas's distinctions between the eternal law, between divine law, natural law, human law. What I would say, I guess speaking now more as a natural theologian, is that for any given faith, what we're going to be doing is we're all going to be abiding by the eternal law anyway, right? Because that applies to everyone. And we're all going to also be abiding by the natural law, whether or not we choose to. We have to abide by that to a certain degree. Question is whether or not we willingly do it and thus maximize the potential to flourish, or we choose to push it away. And when it comes to then divine law, which I believe is the revealed law, right? The revelations that we have. When it comes to that, I think that as Muslims, we have to make sure, and as Christians and as any other faith, where the boundary between the secular and the religious tend to be, because Muslims have to, and Christians and Jews have to be able to live with secular people. And this is where I tend to use more of a utilitarian way of thinking and say, well, if pushing a more unified religious and political agenda comes at the expense of harmony of the state, that's obviously not a wise choice to make. And to try and go for, try and implement Sharia law across the entire nation, which, by the way, Sharia law and Sharia law and say Australian law is about like 90% similar. There are only a few things that are different, really. The nature of the punishments, nature of the crimes to a certain degree, because obviously in Sharia law, the crime is not only against the state and the people who we do it against, but also against God as well. God is a recognized participant in the legal calculations, whereas on a secular law, it's just about humans. But when it comes to making sure that we don't generate more disharmony than harmony, that's a very important thing, because otherwise the person who tries to, like the religious fundamentalists from any faith, if they try and say, well, no, because metaphysically, philosophically, God is the ultimate lawgiver, therefore we have to have him built into the codes of our legal system. That's great in theory, sure. Let's strive for that maybe one day. But if we try and implement it right now, again, we commit the same error that the communists and the egalitarians and the libertarians commit, of trying to bring about change too rapidly, and change that is very far from what is currently normal for everyone, or the average for everyone right now. So my thought is that, Sharia law works if everyone's going to abide by that law, but not everyone will, because not everyone believes in Islam. So if not everyone believes in it, then it does not make sense, because they are going to be bound to principles that they don't agree to. So what do we do? Like with multiculturalism and cultural pluralism, we say, okay, what precepts of law can we agree upon? What precepts do we disagree upon? And maybe figure out some way to establish both secular courts and Christian courts and Sharia courts to deal with these things specifically, while not violating the overall system as well. That seems to me to be at least a goal to aim towards. I don't know whether if it's a realizable thing, I'm not sure.
Yeah, but I think that the problem is that people are threatened by the idea that even you would say it is a goal, right? I think that's that scares people.
Yeah.
So especially like, I don't speak personally as someone who is like this, but for some Christians, they say, no, we like the Christian precepts, we like the Christian law, we like our Western traditions and the standard rule of law, that there is one supreme rule of law. Well, I don't even think Christians would be that type of positivist, but still, like, we like the idea of there being a rule of law, and that the fact that you would even say that we should eventually strive towards this, but very slowly. It kind of, in the Western media, there is this kind of impression of Islam being parasitic, which is not, I don't know if it's terribly healthy for us, but the depiction of Muslims that way. But what would you say to somebody who has that fear?
That we are parasitic.
Yeah, and that
we're trying to take over. Look, there are, like in any grouping of people, there are always going to be those who are going to have more tyrannical leanings. People who are going to want to commandeer what is already a fairly well-established and good thing and turn it into their own ideal. The extreme of that for the Islamic context is ISIS, where they say, their conception is the only right conception at the price of sacrificing, literally killing people to suit their agenda. That's the extreme on that end, as communist Russia was the extreme. But we wouldn't say that communism is totally wrong based on what communists did. They have to analyze the precepts on their own grounds. In terms of Muslims being parasitic on Western values and Western culture, again, first I would say that Muslims were a big part of developing Western values. So we're not really parasitic, we're almost reclaiming those to a certain degree.
Yeah.
I guess what the leaps and bounds forward in science and so on in the Islamic golden era which were lost, Muslims need to really consider what happened that made us go downhill and reclaim our sovereignty and take back, well, not take back as in take away, but reconnect and reconnect with a way to, on every single level, become good citizens, basically. And it's a part of my faith, right? You know, I believe one of the articles, not of faith, but what the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, advised us is, whenever you're in a given country that's not your own, abide by their laws. The laws which are against your religion, don't abide by, because ultimately it's the eternal law, God's law, that you are ultimately answerable to, and the state of your soul is contingent on God's laws. But part of God's law is willingly living with the laws of the land that you live in right now. So as long as we can navigate that fine line, then I think that we are going to be okay. So when people say that Islam is just parasitic, it's like any rank black and white label that doesn't properly handle the nuances. And I tend to find that we have to have black and white thinking. We have to understand what the blacks and the whites are in order to navigate the gray areas, but we can't just have black and white thinking. We have to have both.
Yeah, and you know, the more I think about it, that same argument could be used against Christianity by a secularist, right? So the idea is that for Christians, we want the world to look more like the kingdom of God, the messianic kingdom that we believe Christ will one day bring to the earth and rule the earth for 1,000 years and so forth. We want that just kingdom and that just society, and we gradually move towards it, right? But then the secularist, who maybe is radically, let's say, I don't know, pro-abortion, right? They say, yeah, you keep your church and your religious beliefs out of here. But we say, no, it's not just purely religious. I think you would even offer arguments for why, like, Islam understands human flourishing in a proper way, and these are things that we implicitly believe, right? So, you know, Christians would do the same project as well. And therefore, I don't know, some of the arguments seem to have a double standard built within them. But let me get to two final questions. Yeah. So I remember, this might sound novice to me, but I was reading, you know, so I first read Bernard Lewis and some of his writings on Islam, and the impression that I got from Bernard Lewis was that, you know, Islam is kind of aggressive and hostile. Then I read Edward Said, and Edward Said kind of brought a more nuanced position. He said, what was it? Well, he said basically there are two problems, right? There's one problem where people demonize Islam, and there's another problem where people kind of just overdo Islam in a sense and say, oh yeah, Islam is so perfect and it's so great and like everybody practices it really well. And it's like, well, no, there's a nuance. There's a middle part where it says, look, Islam is a religion, and, you know, people practice it differently. People do different things on the basis of, you know, so-called on that basis of that religion in the name of Allah and so forth. So let's go to one extreme, right? So do you think the left, I mean, for some odd reason, the left and Islam are considered, well, I don't think it's odd, but the left and Islam are considered friends with each other, or at least Muslims, not Islam, but Muslims and the left are considered friends. Do you think that the left has done much for the Muslim community?
Look, insofar as they use their liberal and, I guess, equality generating principle, I think that they've helped out a lot, because I could be cynical and say, well, look, the left has just found another victim group to champion, right? But that's very simplistic. No, like, I think that they recognize that there are good people within Islam. There are good Muslims, and we should not demonize it too far, like conservatives tend to demonize it. I mean, in my country, there is a fairly famous, or in this case, infamous senator called Pauline Hanson, right? Have you ever heard of her?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, she's so she would be considered, I think, fairly conservative, and she just doesn't understand Islam very well. She tends to be very belligerent. You know, she's against halal. She thinks that halal is like this, like, evil entity that's going to go around and infiltrate Western values.
Well, can you explain what halal is?
So halal basically is what is permissible, right? So we hit halal and
haram.
Haram. So haram is not permissible. Halal is permissible. So food has to be treated a certain way. It is haram to eat pigs, say, for example, or for a Muslim to drink alcohol. So she thinks that these concepts or these conceptions are just intrinsically anti-West. And so what the left does is the left sees people like her and goes, oh, wow, she's against that. And it's almost like a kind of reactionary. So she thinks that, therefore, there must be some good in that. If we're against her, enemy of my enemy is my friend, right?
I see. Yeah.
I think that's part of what happens there. But the left also recognizes that Muslims are people and we are equal in some in qualitatively valuable way. So we ought to be given the correct hearing. And I think that on a deeper level, it's very important that we have both liberals and conservatives existing, because otherwise opinions tend to skew towards one direction more than the other, and we end up with a homogenous way of thinking about things.
And that's very dangerous for any society.
Yeah. I recently looked up the Heterodox Academy. It's very, very cool stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the more I reflect back on my life, I don't know if I told you much about my story, but I started off as a liberal democratic socialist, and I was kind of fully on board with the left's agenda. There were some areas where I, as a Christian, kind of was like, well, I don't know if I can agree with that. But regardless, I mostly agreed with everything that was said. And I really got into Malcolm X. I really loved his work, and I admired Islam. And I remember, I have a Muslim neighbor, and she's just the most wonderful woman in the world. And, every time I'm with her, it's just, she says blessings, and it's just a wonderful experience, right? And I kind of began to see two sides of the world. And eventually I became a conservative, but I never forgot what I learned as a liberal and what I saw in humanity. And what, the narrative against Muslims is just so incredibly unfair and unjust towards them. It doesn't even give them the opportunity to really show that, well, I don't even know. It kind of seems unfair that you say, you need to show it. That presumption is there. But my final question to you is very simple. What can conservatives do, or rather, what are the common beliefs and values that are shared between conservatives and Muslims, and what are ways that we can help that other conservatives can see the good in Islam and Muslims and get along?
So, from my understanding, the most important commonalities between Islam and Muslims, well, Islam and conservatives, is one, the conservation of good traditional practices and habits. In this regard, Islam is incredibly conservative, right? One of the central tenets of the faith is that the Quran has been absolutely unaltered for more than almost 1.5 centuries now. That's as conservative as you can possibly get, right? So we very much do hold steadfast to that kind of value. The relationship between the individual and the family and the society and the political community at large, where we're not atomistic and we're not communistic either. It's a very balanced communitarian way of thinking about things. So to go back to Aristotle for a second, I think that Islam is in that golden mean between a radical libertarianism and a radical communism, where the individual has sovereignty, and while also recognizing that the individual has the responsibility as a sovereign individual to bring about justice, be it social justice or otherwise. Knowledge is also a very, very big one. We were told repeatedly, learn, develop yourselves, progress, but don't be a progressive, right? Make sure that you educate yourself as much as you possibly can. You know, Islam really is it's kind of a perfectionistic way of thinking. And part of the reason why I attach myself to Aristotle's kind of ethics is because it's about, so it's, 5 daily prayers. We do it every single day, over and over and over, to build the habit of thinking about God, thinking about the good things in life. How do we become better citizens? We learn. We go to the mosque, go to uni, and we teach ourselves. And so I have it not rough, but I have a big responsibility as a Muslim, because knowledge is, people who gain and develop knowledge almost have an obligation to teach that when they can. So for someone like myself, my job as a Muslim is to make sure that I learn the best that is said and thought, philosophy, theology, sociology, whatever, from both an Islamic and a secular point of view, and then teach as much as I possibly can. Do interviews like this one, write books, host lectures where we bring conservatives and Muslims together and hash out probably where are the common, what amongst ourselves do we conserve, and what amongst ourselves do we say, Islam does it better here, conservatism does it better here, practically speaking, and move on from there.
Well, Jeremy, I think this has been one of my favorite interviews of all time. I really enjoyed getting to know you, and I think we covered just a marathon of all sorts of important topics. And I think the next interview that we have to that we can schedule, we need to talk about masculinity and that kind of psychology of all those issues and so forth. But I think that's all the time we have for now, and I want to thank you, Jeremy. This has been the 16th episode of Intellectual Conservatism. It'll probably be by the end of this 16, 17, or 18. We'll figure it out. But Jeremy, is there any last thing you want to say before we close the show?
Besides, like my meme page.
Yeah. Go like Aristotelian memes. Great page.
Yeah. I was going to say, thank you very much for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure. This is technically our first conversation, in person. But I think that this is a testament to the spirit of philosophy of being a good person, is to be able to meet up with someone and for the first time be able to navigate very, very deep things and not take things personally if anything personal is said or anything offensive or whatever have you, to interpret what the other says with a charitable lens. I think that if we really take the principle of charity seriously, going forth for everyone, it leads to a much better society at large.
Well, Jeremy, I want to thank you. This has just been an amazing interview. So hopefully next week we're going to have other interviews with other different scholars. I'm mostly going to explore the issues of religion, but soon we'll get into the psychology of men and other really pressing social concerns. But as for now, thank you for this episode, and have a great day.